Hola,
Hola, ¿qué
¿qué
tal?
tal? ¿Cómo estás?
Bien, muy bien.
Bueno, eh, hoy comenzamos entonces la segunda serie de archivos Redux. El semestre pasado tuvimos los primeros 8 y ahora tenemos estos segundos 8 del segundo semestre coordinados por Ana Font, que también es coordinadora del archivo de arquitectura de la escuela. Así que buenísimo, estamos volviendo a empezar con esta segunda parte.
Temporada 2 del Redux.
Sí. Eh, y vamos a ver una conferencia de Bret Steele del 28 de noviembre de 2013, o sea, hace casi 7 años, ¿no?
Ujú. Sí, 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 claramente.
Sí,
Pasó todo este tiempo. Nos vamos un poco más atrás en en esta segunda temporada. Hay varias, me parece, de 2013. Igual las iremos revelando de a poco, pero bueno, son 8 más y la diferencia, creo, con el primer semestre es que vamos a estar cada 2 semanas, ¿no? Como every other week.
claro. Sí.
Así que nada, no, si quieres, a lo mejor empezamos contextualizando esta porque tiene un poco vínculos con alguna del semestre pasado. Porque, bueno, como ya veníamos siempre contando, las conferencias forman parte de ciclos y en este caso el ciclo Hacer Escuela. En esa instancia estaba muy recién empezando y el semestre pasado vimos una conferencia de Bob Somol que era sobre hacer escuela, pero en 2018. Sí, 2018. Entonces, en realidad estamos yendo más a los inicios y eso va a ser parte del tono que tiene esta conferencia, porque en 2013 digamos, esta etapa de la ditela, en la que, como digamos, en esta época la era de 2012 a 2020 estaba muy fresca y había muchas conversaciones de cómo es una escuela de arquitectura, cómo tiene que formarse, qué forma tiene que tener, y entonces esa discusión estaba muy intensa y muy central en todas las discusiones en la escuela, y había venido hacía unos meses Iñaki Ábalos, que en ese momento era chairman del Departamento de Arquitectura del GSD, también había estado Jorge Silvetti en una conversación con Ciro, que bueno, era más abarcativa, pero también obviamente se habló de pedagogía. Entonces la visita de Bret Steele en noviembre, que ya era bastante al final del semestre, antes de cerrar ese curso, ese año lectivo, terminó como de culminar un poco esa serie de conversaciones. Entonces, como se va a ver en la conferencia, hay como bastantes preguntas y bastantes inquietudes pensadas como algo que estaba sucediendo en real time, ¿no? Digamos, en la ditela.
Sí, no, y es interesante un arquitecto presentando una escuela de arquitectura, digamos. Me parece que hay bueno, evidentemente según qué arquitecto, pero en todo caso hay algún plano compartido. No porque, digamos, en la conferencia está esta idea de las plataformas, ¿no?
Sí.
Como la arquitectura de una escuela de arquitectura, en varios sentidos.
Ujú. Sí, 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 es verdad. Creo que Bret comenta bueno, que va a hacer una estructura como tripartita de la charla, pero que principalmente considera que él lo que hace es construir plataformas para que sucedan cosas, ¿no? Y creo que así es como define en como metanivel, cómo entiende él que es una gestión cultural de una escuela. Bueno, que no es natural tampoco decirlo así, aunque pueda sonar como obvio. Que sea esa construcción y bueno, y antes cuando charlábamos también comentamos digamos, de la pertinencia en estos momentos de estas discusiones sobre pedagogía que están muy, muy sobre la mesa y bueno, y particularmente en Proyecto 3 el semestre pasado en nuestro taller estuvimos trabajando sobre la pedagogía, estamos trabajando sobre el edificio de la AI, ¿no? Y creo que una de las características también es cómo Bret intervino en el edificio mismo, haciendo que la forma de la escuela tuviera que ver con la forma de la cultura que se desarrolla en la escuela. Entonces, lo de las plataformas aparece como en una literalidad no bastante importante, que es cuál es la arquitectura de la escuela de arquitectura. Y eso creo que nos interesa mucho, bueno, a mí particularmente como parte digamos, de líneas de investigación que estamos llevando a cabo ahora y del hecho de que lo estamos repensando todos un poco, ¿no? En qué consiste enseñar arquitectura y cómo debería seguir siendo. Entonces, nada, la pregunta creo que es actual y su manera de aproximarla es interesantemente provocativa todavía ahora, ¿no? Como con otro, no literalmente la misma provocación, como si fuera una provocación de otro orden, pero sigue siendo provocativa, ¿no?
Sí, ¿qué pensás de eso, del título de la conferencia, ¿no? Anti-realismo.
Sí, bueno, eso creo que es como una... Él comenta eso de que la cuestión del antirrealismo es no dejar que la arquitectura sea el problem solver, ¿no? Como que no te hagan responder y resolver problemas, sino que construyas esos problemas. Eso creo que es el inicio, y después está toda la cuestión más de la idea de experimentación que la AA tiene desde siempre y que él hace un reframing, pero también se refiere, por ejemplo, a ese momento del IIT de Mies y del IID de Alvin Boyarsky, ¿no? Que él cuenta esa transición entre decir, bueno, cambias la T por la D, cambias technology por design, y cambia todo, porque la estructura antirrealista es una estructura en la cual no hay estructura, ¿no? Es como si fuera, no es que en primero, segundo, tercer año se enseña tales cosas, sino que es esta voluntad justamente de las plataformas en un sentido como más él habla de la tecnología porque es lo que está pasando en 2013 con las redes, ¿no? Y habla de las redes y de los...
Como una plataforma de planta libre, quizás.
Sí, no sé. Sí,
No, como lo de la estructura.
Sí.
No sé.
No sé, es como que es más virtual, no sé, mi entendimiento de la cosa es como...
Sí, sí, no, decía virtualmente una plataforma virtual de planta libre, pero no sé, por lo de lo anti o lo de...
Sí, puede ser, puede ser.
Literalmente pensar en un zócalo o una losa o lo que sea.
Claro.
Como modelo virtual igual, como de organización de una institución o lo que sea.
¿Qué pensabas tú de lo antirreal que te hacía?
No, me coincido en lo que decís, que es provocativo. Lo de anti me parece que puede ser un momento. Me pregunto cuál es el que sigue a lo anti, ¿no? Como deja abierto por lo menos eso, como de cómo salir de la negación, digamos.
Claro, exacto. Sí.
Pero bueno, quizás encontremos algunas pistas ahora reviendo la conferencia en eso, ¿no?
Sí,
No sé.
creo que sí, es interesante verla, es muy energizante y atraviesa también toda una serie de momentos, creo que menciona cosas muy claves, así que veámosla y a lo mejor repensamos eso de la...
Buenísimo, buenísimo. Bueno, vemos la conferencia entonces. Nos vemos dentro de 2 semanas.
Dale, gracias Manuel.
Chao, Ana, hasta luego.
Bueno, es un gusto introducir a Bret Steele en la escuela. Es parte de un ciclo que estamos un poco esbozando con Julián, que se trata de hacer escuela y que es algo que quisiera introducir como esta idea de que hacer una escuela y hacer escuela son dos cosas distintas y buscar en qué consiste todo hacer escuela. Tuvimos la presencia de Iñaki Ábalos hace unos meses, también de Jorge Silvetti, que de alguna manera nos dio algunas pistas de esa cuestión, de sus épocas en las que era Sherman, y hoy tenemos a Bret, que es una presencia central en este sentido. Le pedimos a Bret, veremos cuándo de eso va a ser, pero le pedimos a Bret que su conferencia muestre el trabajo actual de la Architecture Association, y que esboce como algún tipo de lineamientos acerca de en qué consisten las tendencias actuales de investigación, de trabajo, de pensamiento, de docencia en la escuela. Como saben, yo enseñé en la escuela hace unos 15 años, ahí es donde lo conocí a Bret. Cuando llegué a la escuela, yo era muy chico, tenía 32 años, Jordi era mi alumno, y una de las primeras cosas que escuché cuando mis alumnos me decían, me hablaban de otros lugares de la escuela, era justamente las cosas que se hacían en el DRL, que era el lugar donde que Bret dirigía en esa época. Yo me preguntaba quiénes eran estos big guys que estaban ahí haciendo qué cosas. But I'm going to say in Spanish, you have big guys. Yeah, big guys were you and Patrick and the others at that time when I met you. Y era como, o sea, en esa época había una especie de constelación que creo que para mí resultó muy importante por lo menos, y creo que para otros también, y que formó una especie de cultura, una especie de escuela en el sentido en el sentido más metafórico, y Bret era uno de ellos. De todos ellos, Bret quizás era el que más tenía una capacidad organizativa y ejecutiva importantes, y llevó adelante el DRL desde ser un programa muy pequeño hasta ser un programa muy exitoso y con mucha afluencia de alumnos y con mucha producción de ideas nuevas y diría de figuras, no solo de ideas nuevas, figuras del pensamiento. Luego de eso, hace 7 years, 8 years, hace unos 8 años, Bret es el chairman o director de la EIA. Les doy un poquito su biografía, porque seguramente lo conocen, pero dirige la Escuela de Arquitectura de la Socialized en Londres, incluyendo su programa público, publicaciones, membresía y actividades de recaudación de fondos. Sus proyectos actuales incluyen un masterplan para la expansión de la sede histórica de la EIA en Bedford Square y del campus rural en Hood Park, Dorset. Desde 2005, Bret ha contratado 150 nuevos profesores de Europa, Asia y las Américas, que ahora enseñan en Londres, junto a 100 profesores de la Visiting School, que opera internacionalmente, y esta es una de las áreas que Bret ha desarrollado especialmente, que es como la globalización de la escuela. Las iniciativas de Bret en la EE han incluido el lanzamiento de un laboratorio digital de prototipos, el nuevo campus de Dorset, nuevos cursos de maestría. Esto es un tema bastante importante, que espero que Bret hable sobre el tema. Hay una cantidad de cursos de maestría y programas para graduados en la EA que ya no tienen como esa voluntad disciplinar en el sentido territorial, sino son más como líneas de investigación. O por lo menos así las interpreto yo. En el 96 fundó el DRL, como les decía antes, un innovador programa de máster basado en equipos que luego codirigió durante 9 años. Y ha editado varios libros, como Negotiate My Boundary, esa es aquella época, Corporate Fields, de sus comienzos como director, Design and Research, First Works, Architectural Experimentation of the 60s and 70s, Supercritical, Peter Eisen and Winston Puljas, O14, Networks, An Anthology of Distributed Design Cultures, and Machine Works, The Rise of Modern Machinic Architectures. Hay una cantidad de actividades que Bret hace también a nivel publicar, por supuesto. Es una persona muy prolífica, es de alguna manera un activador, una persona que genera plataformas de desarrollo de conocimiento y de intercambio. Y quizás solamente referirme a que la Architectural Association, para aquellos que no están demasiado familiarizados con la escuela, es una escuela que ahora tendrá unos 170 años, se inició como un club y es la más antigua y única escuela privada de arquitectura actualmente activa en el Reino Unido. Ha sido una escuela sumamente influyente en los últimos 50 años, particularmente desde los 60. Por décadas ha sido reconocida como un influyente líder mundial de la educación de arquitectos, y sus graduados, a quienes todos conocemos, gente muy famosa del campo, han recibido premios importantes como Pritzkers o medallas del RIBA o premios Steele o del American Institute of Architecture o Young Office of the Year Awards en el Reino Unido. Sin mucho más, lo único que quisiera es, ojalá que Bret nos introduzca un poco estas cuestiones que se están desarrollando ahora en la escuela, y de alguna manera me gustaría que nos haga un poco reflexionar sobre los caminos que nosotros mismos estamos tomando y cómo se pueden o no vincular o relacionar desde nuestro contexto con este tipo de investigación. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca.
Apologies for Brazilian Airlines getting me a bit later than planned. A talk this evening on a topic I've been working on for the last few months, which has to do with the question of realism in architectural schools and the ways in which architecture schools increasingly find themselves defined by the solution of what everybody is saying is realistic problems in the world. We live in a world of huge, monstrous, real problems. Ours is an era in which all of us, I think, get pulled into an expectation that our job is solving other people's problems. That's certainly a part of the profession, and it's part of what architects do, but I think at a certain level you can say architecture is suffering from an excess of realism, like reality TV and other forms that are obsessed with the term. I think it's a production also. I really believe that the job of schools today, to a certain level, is the invention of new problems that take the place of old problems. And what I've been working on the last few weeks is a piece that tries to think through the ways in which an architectural school can play a part of a larger project in the creation of new problems today, which once we start to focus on them, might create a new way to think about where architecture is going. The subtitle to the talk, so if the main title is Architecture and Anti-Realism, the sort of subtitle or tag theme that I'll be working with is the way in which you could say a search engine is a model for how a school really can operate as a kind of defining technology in architectural culture. For many years, I and my colleagues, including Ciro and many others around the world, have been very interested in the question of research and how topics of design can be thought of in a culture of research today. We live in global economies that are defined really by the investment in research and development. Huge, vast empires that, despite having complete control of their universes, still invest vast amounts of money and energy and effort to uncover new things, to, in their view, stay abreast of what's happening in the world. I think we all know that architecture operates with research in a slightly different way than many fields, in ways that are self-directed, self-fulfilling, and to a certain level self-satisfying in terms of what it is they achieve in any given project. And what I'm trying to do is to start to distinguish between the question of search and research, and the way in which there might be a paradigm for how schools, and not just offices and other parts of architectural culture, can use search to uncover ideas and projects which you all, throughout the next 80 years or so in your careers, will be the means by which architecture itself is pushed forward. So it's a simple talk. I've organized it in 3 pretty simple parts. And it's not just about schools, it's about the ways in which schools like mine and many others really operate as search engines today. 3 simple parts, as I said. I'm going to show a little bit of student work because I was asked to do that. Share with you a little bit of what we do in London, although increasingly in many places other than London. I'll talk a little bit about what I do, which is very different than what everybody else does in the school, but which, working with those students, develops a kind of collective project which, in our redesign of the school, we can work with the ways in which students are trying to redesign or think about architecture in new and different ways. So here's my sketch of the talk. Keep it all like super simple. Again, 3 parts. You'll be satisfied to know that actually the students are going to dominate the story. My work isn't nearly as important as theirs, and that's probably the first thing I'd say about our school. My job is actually just creating a series of platforms for people to get on with it. I'm going to show you the various ways in which we do that in the school. And of course, when we work together in the right way, what we're obviously trying to do with that larger collective project is break many different kinds of boxes, including the walls and the ceilings and the floors of the buildings we inhabit back in London. So, is a setup to that a short preamble, which will give you a little bit of background to the way in which we're approaching each of those categories of work. The preamble is a pretty simple one. For people of my generation that arrived in architecture, and in particularly the architectural studio in the 1990s, as I began teaching in 1995, which was the year in which the world released its last version of an operating system that was designed for a single computer, an arcane piece of technology called Windows 95, replaced the following year by an equally bad Microsoft product called Windows NT, but which was designed for machines to talk to one another. That was the year that we created this thing that Cyril mentioned called the Design Research Lab, in which I and a group of colleagues became very interested in the obvious ways in which architectural culture was about to get a heck of a lot more collaborative because of the design platforms that would soon sweep across the studios that you all work with today. I think what we all now know 15 years later is it's been pretty exhausting work, and none of us, in fact, are satisfied with the idea that those appliances or those devices are going to be the sole means by which we will search for new ideas and new projects. Equally, one of the things that happened is those networks began to broadcast themselves out beyond the boundaries of studios. We all, as architects and teachers, started occupying space in a different way. This is one of my colleagues that I was with for 2 weeks in LA in 2003, who spent his entire 2-week period on the loading dock of the Beverly Motel because it had the best wireless, so that he could work with his students back in London. The studio, as we knew it, wasn't just reconfiguring itself internally, its boundaries were breaking open in ways that in this talk I'd like to show and suggest not as something new, but in fact is almost the very opposite, as simply a next iteration of how the architect has always invested him or herself in the use of connective technologies whose primary purpose is simply the transfer of ideas in your head and in your project to a larger culture of architecture. That's what the talk is going to try and work through. The point that we started making early on in that project with our studio was in fact the arrival of this kind of pure information space, the seemingly pure information space of a network studio. Initially seemed a little alien to the kind of spaces many of us had inhabited for 10 or 15 years before that, but in fact can be seen as resonating in many ways with what had happened in art and production of culture in many other fields for decades before. And the kinds of examples I would show my students in the 1990s are, for example, what happened to music in the 1960s, when the instruments that those composers or those artists used were for the first time given electricity. So, and you all know the story of rock and roll, right? And this funny guy, I presume he got down here at some point in his short life. What happens is, at first, musicians just make things louder. They've got electricity, they've got amplifiers, things get louder. But what very quickly happens is artists like this take control of the feedback loops of the sounds moving through and famously turn that into the basis for a completely different kind of music. Hendrix wasn't the only one. These kind of people who were the heirs of that moment, of the electrification of first the instrument and then the recording studio in music, very quickly realized that's a way to not do what they've been doing before, but to open up a completely different relationship between themselves as a musician, the spaces they work in, and the devices that they work with. So this, for example, is the grandchild of that 60s generation, a 25-year-old kid who lives with his parents outside of London that some of you will listen to today, and whose entire music existence is the equipment that he works with in his parents' bedroom. He occasionally leaves it, I understand, but not for long. We had Brian Eno at the school last year to talk about the moment in which, in 1971, he invents the idea of ambient music, which he does phenomenally by taking a sound and passing it through a loop series of machines, which creates a kind of background soundscape, which of course by now, 30 years on, is the stuff of an entire industry working with that kind of sound, but which, as he says, as a composer, left him out of work in the way that he had been trained. He literally, he said, and this is the famous backside of his discrete music album, 1975, in which he's so impressed with what he's discovered that he actually puts a diagram on the back for all his fans to try and understand it. What he says is he puts the music in the machine, hits play, the stuff starts taping and looping, he walks out the door, has a cup of coffee, comes back the next day, and he has 8 hours of music recorded. He sent the tape off to his record label, and they completely freaked out. Right? They had commissioned a Brian Eno album, and what he gave them was obviously his work in relation to a much expanded field of production. Steve Reich in the upper right corner is the American version of that story, working between the East and the West Coast, and is actually the person that starts to theorize the arrival of serial music, ambient music, and a completely different kind of soundscape. The other way I tried to reassure my students way back when they found themselves staring at these devices for the first time, not quite knowing what to do with them. The other point we tried to make to the students at the end of the 20th century is simply they're at the far end of what had been happening for 100 years in cities worldwide. Right? The electrification of the city, which begins in 1907, 1908, when Thomas Edison is given a contract to wire up Canal Street, starts on that street and basically just spreads across the planet at different speeds in different countries and different places. Like I've just come from England, electricity didn't get there till way later than most of you would imagine. English are slow at everything. And to this day, most architects will see that stuff as something other than what it obviously became, a kind of architectural material. Most of us treat it as exactly this architect is doing. It's the sort of junk stuff that lets him get on with his work above. What we became interested in very much 10, 15 years ago is the way in which that gives us the material to completely rethink how it is architects don't just work, but how they learn this stuff that we call architecture. Now, of course, that story has only continued to accelerate to the point that cables today are increasingly infrequent in rooms like this. But one of the curious things for me in terms of a school is how even the most ordinary habits that we all use throughout our lives, like a student presenting his work to a couple of critics and me at a table, when overlaid with this kind of communication technology, creates audiences within audiences within audiences. And one of the questions we have is, what do you suddenly do when you have more than one audience in any single event within a school? When the conversations are literally multiple, where they're being broadcast in different ways, recorded, distributed. One of the things that you can see, which I always find fantastic in these events, is nobody even knows where to look in the room. Right? Like everybody's looking in a different part of the room, trying to figure out where the action is. You know, and I think one of the questions we face as a school is, what happens? How do you bring focus to things? How do you steer conversations, and how do you open up forms of interaction between people in different audiences that might be sitting around events like this? The most ordinary of sort of things in a school. When audiences have audiences, that formerly intimate, small-scale exchange that would take place between me and my students who just presented their work, like this is my school only 60 years ago, 50 years ago, sort of fireside chat. He's got a pipe. We've got a nice tweed suit, there's a civilized conversation to have. That was the model that architecture schools have worked with for 40 or 50 years after that photograph, right? Things didn't substantially change within the studio space. And of course, as that stuff continues to overlay itself in all of our kind of audience spaces in a school, what happens is they take on this sort of strange property, right? And they start to take on the sort of magical realities of what happens when technologies are perfected to the point that you literally can't see them. I hired this fellow 2 years ago to teach seminars in our history and theory department, and happens to be one of England's best-known magicians. And one of the phenomenal things when he works in spaces in a school is, this is him levitating one of my teachers at the end of last year, is for a world like ours that are totally used to every image being fabricated, when you encounter that sort of bodily performance, you realize your ability to distinguish where technologies stop and experience start has already been leapfrogged by the world we inhabit within a school. So, again, the 3 parts of the talk: students, director, collective project. To start with the students, the context for us in the student work that we've been doing at the AA is that there seems to be a sense today that schools really are sites where students are trying to escape today in ways they haven't in recent decades. in the story I've put together here. The idea for me is that the sort of monastic belief of even modern architecture, that architecture schools were a kind of sacred space separate from the world, is no longer tenable as an argument. This great royal figure in all modern architectural histories, except maybe Brazil's, good for you guys, and we knew he was royal because he called it Crown Hall, the center building in IIT, was a place whose primary purpose as a communication space, look, a completely uninterrupted interior, was a place for producing more Mies. Right? I mean, look at it, his students are adopting the very same pose. He literally went there. This was a world of, I mean, people, scholars have written a better version of this, but it was a place that produced many Mises. Right? It was a place of production. And that was the way in which learning organized itself in the middle of the 20th century, at least in the hands of a fellow like that. And that's what he, of course, produces famously. What he was doing was severing 500 years of architecture schools being organized like this, as the monasteries out of which not just schools of architecture, but universities emerged across Europe in the 15th and 16th century. This is a monastery in Segovia, which happens today, as of about 10 years ago, to have returned to its original status as an architecture school. But what Mies is obviously doing is turning completely inside and out this sort of small cellular structure of a world where in monasteries in Europe at that time, the advanced technologies of the era were being produced, glass is developed, the most advanced communication technologies are developed by the monks and the scholars there, right? They're writing manuscripts which are disseminating ideas across the continent. And what Mies is doing in one fell swoop in the middle of the 20th century is cutting that history of the school at its knees. He's retaining the idea of the school being separate from the world, but its internal organization is being completely turned inside and out. About 20 years after Mies made that sketch of his school called IIT, a fellow at the AA named Alvin Boyarsky launched something called the IID, which was meant to be a parody of IIT, the International Institute not of Technology, but of Design. And for 2 years, he held the first worldwide global symposia on architecture. The other thing he did, and by the way, he was able to do that because that was exactly the moment when Heathrow Airport launched. It's the world's first long-haul jumbo jet destination site. So suddenly, the end of the 60s, the swinging 60s are now a city full of people from different countries coming together. Alvin realized that that was a moment to bring bodies through his school, to encounter the English that he had inherited in that building. The other striking thing he choreographs is he throws out of the school the idea of a fixed architectural curriculum. He literally blows it up and says, you will no more go into a school and learn this in year 1, this in year 2, this in year 3, this in year 4, this in year 5. He says, what you're going to do is walk into a place, you'll have 30 people teaching things that they think is important. You will decide which of those matter to you. They will have to defend that argument to the school, and that's your education. Get on with it. What we still to this day call the unit system of the school, a school that still doesn't have a curriculum for architecture. We have absolutely no idea how to teach architecture. Absolutely no idea, which is why some of the work you'll see is trying to do serious work for us that are in the school. We're hoping they can tell us. I don't have time to go through even a sort of simple matrix of the sort of topics and ideas that are working in the school today, but I pulled out, and I'll do maybe a half a dozen of these very quickly, of what you could say are sort of little clusters of interest. My version of architectural culture today is that it's becoming, like most forms of culture, increasingly tribal in its organization. One of the paradoxes of this communication, information, post-digital life is that, in fact, the world doesn't flatten out, however much it all seems like we're using the same laptop today, so we're the same phone. In fact, what's happening is the other side of that equation. When you go to the Apple store and you click on radio stations, you get 9,000 radio stations that you have access to, each of which have vast communities built around them, sharing their sessions about a particular kind of sound or project. That's something that I think, as a school, we're deeply invested in promoting and exploring in terms of what might come out of it. So, just very briefly, I think a first section that I've got is a peculiar category of student work I've seen in the last couple of years, which is, you could say, architectural bodies in motion, and I mean literally in motion. My students testing architectural space in the most straightforward way imaginable, right? Launching themselves through it. One of the things that you see as the world becomes overwhelmed by connected technologies is that anything really is defined by movement, including the architect's his or her own body. Just a few quick samples, and one of the things I love at these pictures always is like how nobody is at all interested in this film. That's our front door of the main building. She did a series of high jumps off the edge of that. 20 minutes, and nobody even stopped to see what she was doing. Anyway, just a few pictures of, you could say, the body in motion in a very literal sense. Groups of students who in their studios explore actively the continuities or connections between their bodies and that stuff you would normally call architectural structures, for obvious interest in how they might relate. This is a final jury I went to last spring of one of those groups. That's her presenting her architectural project, which went on for a good 20 or 25 minutes. This is part of that same group, who with that interest now takes it out around the world to various performance spaces to present architectural projects in a slightly different form. Studios are in effect, as you might well imagine, not just architects, but choreographers, performance artists, body artists, and many other subdisciplines I have no idea how to even explain, but which are primarily interested in the question of how bodies move through space and feel like that taking command of that becomes the basis for approaching the disciplinary questions of form, performance, brief in new and unexpected ways. And I think one of the points of that project is, of course, it builds upon what we know has already happened since architects like this once imagined bodies only being explainable if they hold absolutely still, right? Corb's entire modular system, which is this bizarre theory that we're all actually the same size, works as long as we all hold still and he measures us, right? Bodies were maybe more stable at one point, but certainly within 10 or 20 years, our understanding of the body, and the reason, let's say, the planet watches these kind of things more than these kind of things, he was never like a big seller in the video market. The reason what we're watching is obviously a definition of not just a film, but the very idea of a story is one that makes sense only by this person's ability to move through space. I used to show the comparison for years to only find my own story ruined totally about 10 years ago by the arrival of an architect who literally includes the inorganic material of her life as a necessary extension of her own body, right? In exactly the way we all do now with, for example, the iPhones that are in most of your hands right now as I'm talking. And the inorganic extensions of communication space are now fundamentally, as they are at the other end of her body, part of this thing we think of the architect's body. And of course, what's happening alongside that point about architects moving in space is basically everything else that's a part of their life is moving in space also. Increasingly, the ability to think of architecture in relation to how its materials travel around the world. This is a team of ours, one of our studios, whose primary brief requirement was fitting into the cargo hold of a certain size plane that went to Heathrow, so that that project could travel with the designers as it gets installed. And of course, the very idea of form is something we now approach through design platforms, that whether the physical structure is moving or not, we know the tools that are being used to conceptualize it, in fact, build into any definition or approach to form movement itself. Right, this is a sketch model a team worked on early on in the development of one of the pavilions that we did a few years ago. This is a site in Zurich that they worked on, and these are the kind of early sketches they're doing. The point of the story is to realize, of course, that thing we think of as the architectural body is already in motion before we all start to stand around it or install it on its site. This is a slightly later stage of that same sort of project. So that category of body is in motion. I thought I would just very briefly show you another sort of range of stuff that's going on, something I like to call amplified prototyping, you know, the return of a kind of making culture to architecture today, which has got, I think, many interesting possible explanations. One of them, of course, would be that we all now are fundamentally experimental in how we learn things because, frankly, we're being asked to use tools that nobody can possibly explain to us or teach in the conventional sense, and that the only way we can begin to take command of them is by actually starting to experiment and work with what they might offer. So these are the kind of studies that I'm sure some of you are used to doing in design studios here at this school. They are fundamentally experimental platforms at this stage in their evolution, simply because they're evolving so quickly that the learning of them requires a kind of active, constant engagement, sort of particulate model-making systems in a digital space, which then ports itself across into the physical material, which in this case it's a sort of 3D brick system that one studio is working with. Works through a series of opposing magnets on 3 different axes that allow it to stack up as a thin or stretch out as a thin material that can be reconfigured. And then as things are learned at that stage of a model, they're obviously fed back in to an earlier digital or computational kind of explanation of the material. And as I did earlier with the point about bodies in space, I think one of the things that's happening is we see the return of a kind of aggressive prototyping sensibility in architecture. It's forcing us to go back and reassess not just figures and careers, but the story of modern architecture itself. One of those books that Cyril mentioned in the introduction is a kind of atlas of a last 100-year development of prototyping sensibilities that you could say have really forwarded architecture at every stage of its development. This fellow who literally reinvented himself, he renamed himself after the experience. Gary went through a sort of midlife crisis, as everyone does in California. Didn't know what he was going to do. Despite being trained in orthodox modernist principles at USC years before that, realized he wanted a completely different project, and the way he got there was he spent every dollar he had on the biggest amount of cheap material he could find, and he started pushing it together and rearranging this house, and over a 6-year period started to settle into a form that becomes the project we know. He does the very same thing as predecessors of his in LA 20 years before. The Eames, these are a series of big plywood shell prototypes of their work, by this point about the middle of the 1950s, who start their office by doing nothing but building a little machine which lived in their bedroom called a Kazam machine, which it took them 5 or 6 years to bend plywood into a form that became things like these chairs and all that other stuff. 20 years before them, exactly the same thing. Jean Prouvé spends every franc he has outside of Paris in his industrial studio to buy the world's first rapid prototyping machine for a design studio. This is what they looked like back then compared to what they look like today. It was a sheet metal bending machine, which he said the only way he could learn to make those components of those great Prouvé projects was to have the machine in the studio, learn it well enough, and working with people trained better than him, that he could then roll that out as the basis for his architectural project. That's the sort of deeper architectural background to these sort of things I think we see today, not just at my school, but in many, many schools around the world. And I don't have time to kind of go through and explain them, but of course what they're all doing at a larger scale. You know, the experiment with materials today, in an age in which new materials are being kind of constantly developed and no one quite knows what they might become. and how those might link back to forms of description that, again, might sit in a digital software domain. This is a similar kind of study of that project. One really bad mistake here, which you'll see in a minute. Watch. It kind of folds in on itself. It's a total disaster. But again, something that is learned, and this is a model generated by the writing of a set of rules that tell these things how to interact. This isn't a drawn model, and it's a way to try and start to describe the performance of material in different ways, which can be fed back then on the actual projects. A slightly different kind of prototype, I've just got 2 or 3 here to show you, would be the prototype that sits not up there or over here, but exactly between those 2 worlds. A design team that developed a kind of interface that did nothing but explain how a modeling system could tell an industrial knitting machine to produce fabrics of different shapes and sizes. And of course, the expertise that sits in those kind of prototypes is in the interfaces that run between worlds that are normally disconnected. Sort of an obvious point, looking at this sort of work, that the idea of an architectural project is a hack more than a plan, something you sort of throw together the best you can. Best image I could find of it was this hack that we built of David Green's project that he first sketched in the 1960s for a wirelessly connected jacket that he could wear as an architect. David was working as a member of Archigram at the time, before things like intranets were even imagined by even the US military. In 2008, for an exhibition of his work, a retrospective show, we flew a kid to China with $500. He bought 1,000 sensors and this sort of ropey material and threw it together for David. So for the first time, 40 years after he sketches it, he could actually wear the thing, which he only did in the gallery. Great disappointment. This sort of hacking, this sort of learning by figuring out best you can. So this is a student that is sort of telepathically talking to her model. And watch her expression. It's the best part of this. Watch. Like, she simply cannot believe it. The jury starts with her in sort of disbelief, and by the end of the session, the thing is more like a pet, like it's starting to get to know her. Right? And there's a completely different sort of relationship between an architect and that thing we refer to as her model. Just maybe a last point or 2 about prototypes. The obvious ways in which they then bring architecture alongside other fields, maker cultures today that exist, in different technologies, which suddenly become necessary collaborators for the development of new systems. Quickly, from prototypes to craft conceits, I wanted to show you at the other end of the spectrum, people in the school that are running from all of that stuff, turning off the electricity and trying to reinvent the conventions of the discipline. People who are drawing on linen or fabric, or working with the topic of the drawing itself as a handcrafted artifact, not just on paper, but on walls, in rooms, making patterns in space. Working with the simplest, most ordinary, everyday materials to see what they offer as a kind of technology. And maybe a last example of that is the sort of craft work that's taking place around this set of structures out in Dorset. We bought a forest, working woodland, which is filled with trees that nobody quite knew what to do, and so as a group of architects, we decided the obvious thing is let's turn the trees into architecture. Bought a bunch of robotic chainsaws and things like that, which are now aimed at this stuff. So the question is, can we, with this world of connected technologies, actually leave the safety of our school, where the AA has been for a century, in a little Georgian square in London, and treat that as an architectural school? Can you bend nature, literally, can you bend nature to your own will as an architect? I just put in 1 or 2 examples to show you, one of the really interesting things for that sort of project is how Jurassic, sort of Neanderthal-like these people who used to stare at computers become when they have to build models that weigh several tons instead of, a piece of cold paper. These are people that live out in the woods. It's students and staff living in the woods and building these structures. So this is their living accommodation for 16 months.
I'm just waking up and it's right. Or dark, doesn't matter if it's dark, I'm just waking up and it's real. more romantic. You're dealing with wood that looks more like wood. It's massive. So when you do a joint in a huge piece of 12 inch by 12 inch, it's got its own beauty. And I think just
the first
something
building
that's
they
been
built
around
out on the site. And one of the things they're trying to work with is in an age in which architecture is overwhelmed by the constant production of images, how can you suspend that activity and turn your attention entirely to the opposite? To a model, this working model is 1.5 times the scale of the eventual building that was realized on site. A weird group up here, a group I like to call the informational cartographers, who are starting all of their projects by basically scanning the Earth with aerial imagery and locating sites in which patterns of development in portions of, this year they're working in Russia, last year they worked in Taiwan. They did an agenda that worked across the coastline of Europe for 3 years. But they're taking the open source, freely available information contained in geosatellite systems, and as architects, taking that data and coding it such that they can generate maps. It's a really weird project, so that they can generate maps that show the speed at which things are developing in different parts of the world. In other words, looking at the information like architects and building into a map an ability to visualize time. Right? And their entire project and the work that they do with their students every year is the conversion of the imagery for the cities we know into things that are now records of time. Unlike the history of a discipline like architecture, which always draws things like Noli plans, time as a frozen quality. The information that's been released by governments worldwide in terms of aerial satellite photography is freely available for teams today to work with, and these guys are trying to approach it as if architects. Next topic, very briefly, collaborative studios. It's a simple story, that's one you all know. This is how I went to school, like in prison, in a dark room on my own, in utter competition with every other soul in the darkness. Right? We work differently today, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we accept that or not, we all now work across systems that make no sense in isolation. Right? These are artificial platforms which are designed to be used not just by collaborators, right? But in ways in which different forms of expertise can come together on platforms around single projects that are being fed through those systems in the space of a studio or a workshop. So there are several programs at the AA, though by no means all, which are interested in this idea of doing single projects as a group, for example. Teams that build a pavilion for the year, that only ever work as a group of 12. Or do installations, right, in which those bodies that are in motion in other groups are actually all trained at specific projects. It's our first year studio last semester. Vengeful histories, for me, at least for my generation, is an interesting topic at the end. The unexpected return of history in the design studios. We've got groups that are spending, for example, like this fellow who spent a year trying to come to terms with Mies, as it seems so many architects have around the world. Spent an entire year, this is his 4th year drawing. He made one drawing for the year, which is a kind of tableau, a 12-foot mural that showed both the career of Mies and what he would be doing to Mies as he had reinvented Mies's career 40 years later. Fabricating artifacts, like this special issue of Time magazine, redesigning Hollywood films like 12 Angry Men to feature Mies as an unexpected character in narratives that live outside of architecture, and in effect returning architecture to the definition of his own identity in relation to those figures that have long shaped the field. There are more modern versions of that at the A, like these people that were living in a bubble out of Hook Park. I found sort of reliving a moment of David Green's career 40 years before. He and Archigram crawled into a series of bubbles, put on these goggles which they had designed, which would become their interface to the city. And I think one of the key conceits really in the history of architecture is how one architect defines his self in relation to another. Right? This is the awkward, unexpected comparison of Rem Koolhaas's left hand over Paris and Le Corbusier's right hand over Paris 60 years before. Right? And the way in which ideas and sensibilities pass through generations of different thinkers. The vengeful history group at the A right now are being led by an Italian, a Venetian Italian named Pier Vittorio, looking at topics like sacred space, the deep history of sacred space and how that was broken in modern architectural culture, and again resonates with, in London, with a group of people that for decades have been interested in topics that most architecture didn't talk about. This is a drawing that a student named Quinlan Terry, who's the world's leading classicist, made the year he dropped out of the AA in the 1970s. Just one or two images over here on the right, a group you could think of as the image resurrectionists, people who spend their life manipulating images as the basis for an architectural project, one that you all will know in many forms, either in terms of the grand rendered image, the manipulated conventional plan and section, turning itself into a model, a student who spent her year doing hand drawings of a camp that she was working with, a group of people that she was working with in Bulgaria. And again, I think something that sort of resonates with the longer history in a school like ours of people who invent careers out of developing very particular ways to draw. This is Peter Wilson's drawing in the 1970s before he leaves the school and becomes an architect. And again, that, as I'm doing with each of these topics, just showing a sort of deep history of these sort of experiments in architecture. So to go back to a suspicious character like Mies, you see the very same thing. This is a 1940, famous 1940 image of his museum for a small city, in which he appropriates a photograph of another architect's work. This would be illegal today in America because of intellectual property and image right protection. But Mies borrowed a photograph of Albert Kahn's factory and overlaid a series of pieces of paper to create the kind of Miesian space of this museum. And that project today, of course, is this kind of project, right? Where someone takes, that isn't a photograph of Philip Johnson's glass house. It doesn't have a top floor, for those of you that haven't got there yet in architectural history. But of course, this isn't just a manipulated image. This is an example of a piece of work by a French architect who, for the last 10 years, has done nothing but, this is his career, to rework the images of iconic architectural projects that we all know. The blurring of lines made possible by this kind of media, some think is exponentially increased over the way photography happened before. But of course, one of the things it reminds us is that even with Mies and his, in my version of the story, his invention of Photoshop in 1917, which simply becomes industrialized 60 years later, even in Mies, what we see is modern communication technologies like photography being turned into a completely different way to describe space. So again, just an iteration of a project that's been running for decades. I'm going to skip through the next session quickly, which was just going to give you a few highlights of what the tutors do to explain why the students do what they do. Sorry, these are two of 250 tutors at the school this year. But who are basically leading studios and practices experimenting with projects and ideas in very similar ways. And what those tutors do is they write a kind of agenda, a one-paragraph agenda saying, this year we will do this. They then stand up in front of the school and defend that idea to the school, and students are attracted or not to the studios and join into these projects throughout the year. So, with that as the main category, I just wanted to show you the other side of the project in London right now is the question of how to rethink the organization of the school itself right now. I have the great pleasure of being a designer and designing a school and listening to a school that wants architectural schools to evolve and change. And one of the things we did then is look at how architecture schools have done that since their origins. 1870s at the École des Beaux-Arts, the avant-garde European schools, the industrialized American graduate schools of the 1970s, John Haydock's Cooper Union. This at the same scale as my school back in London, the AA school, a school of 650 people in the 1870s. This year we have 749 students in London. And what you see is, of course, schools do evolve and change, right? The argument I would make is that schools are simply a piece of technology. We know this because they're entirely artificial, like they didn't fall from heaven. Right? They're not natural geological entities. They were designed in the 19th century in Europe especially to serve a purpose that some people so disliked they reinvented them dramatically in the early 20th century, but that schools have continuously evolved. And in fact follow a pattern of miniaturization that's not unlike other technologies. Right? We live, think, talk, communicate differently. And I think as communication technologies in the 20th century explode, I think you guys know the story of like how anxious that makes architects initially. Right? Figures like Lou Kahn develop an elaborate theory for all that junk stuff, which he says should go here, so that we can have architecture as we know it here, what he calls sort of servant and serve spaces. He develops a huge kind of theory about the middle of the 20th century. American commercial architecture tries to squeeze it together to a minimal footprint so that architecture can live around it, invents something called the core, right? All connected technologies go in one place, and it becomes such a cliche that an AA graduate in the 1980s takes that very diagram and flips it inside out. We've done it once before at the Pompidou. Richard Rogers, Lloyd's building in London, right? Where the exterior, instead of all this stuff being buried in the middle, the exterior becomes a series of towers that holds all of that. But what you see is clearly the anxiety that this connected technology is something other than architectural space. It needs to be given a position. It needs a home. The bottom line is those architects lose that battle at some point. Right? That stuff just continues to overwhelm and overlay architectural space of all kinds. Right? This is a picture I took at a little airport in Germany a couple of years ago. This is humanity down here. This little airport. 75% of this section is all that other stuff. Like weighing down like it's going to crush these poor people late at night in Hamburg. That only gets more dramatic in the last 10 or 15 years as that stuff just continues to pour out and work its way through offices and architecture schools. This is a picture I took of one of our server rooms a couple of years ago, before we had to enlarge it to make more space for this. Providing the means to communicate between projects and people that, of course, that courtyard did in Paris 120 years before that. As architecture schools emerge into the world, they, of course, start hidden away up in attics and ceilings. This is the first architecture school in America, MIT, literally up in the attic of the university, hidden away at night. Like, this is why we all got so used to working all night. We weren't interrupting anyone. We come late to faculties at universities. Engineering is in place. Other fields have taken all of the prime real estate. We're stuck up in the ceiling. In London, it's the same story. Our first building, which we only acquire about 60 years after the school was formed, we're all squeezed. This is my predecessor and a few of his students in that class living up in the attic of a building on Tufton Street in London. And one of the things we've become very interested in back at the AA is how to take that space of the school and treat it not as a setting where you and I teach and learn, but as a medium to reconfigure to serve our own purposes, which is something we've been experimenting with to the extent to which English law allows us for the last few years. We happen to inhabit what are called Grade 1 listed buildings, which were built 250 years ago by the same person that owns them today, that lives in Bedford, which has very strict rules on what you're actually able to do. That said, we've put a series of plans in place that allow us to start to work with and open up the different rooms of that school and to allow students to be the ones that start to reconfigure and shape the space of the school itself. So not just physical openings, but the overlaying. This is a projection that one of our diploma units did, a full-size projection of how energy is misused in these old Georgian buildings today. So overlaying of media, new structures, the carving of new spaces that run through all of them to allow the little worlds to talk to one another in different ways, lighting the spaces, decorating the spaces, giving them new ceilings periodically, and in effect, just as architects would want to do anywhere, treat the space of a school not as a site, but as a material, as a medium. Right? Since the architect emerged as a figure in the Middle Ages, and this is our This is our ancestors, right? These are the first figures that are declared architects in the world before the Renaissance. Monks living in cells, seemingly, in the story we're all told, in isolation from the world, but interestingly, always using technologies whose primary purpose was to talk to the outside world. Right? Not just the drawings they would make, but the production of manuscripts, which would then travel to different sites, that would record the things they were doing, like perfecting the grinding of glass to make eyeglasses, metallurgical experiments that create iron, eventually steel when it's industrialized. And the point of monastic life, this is the other side of the experiment we've been doing back in London, the other side of monastic life is that those sites are always part of a larger order. Orders existed across the continent of Europe, and those books and documents and records that were being produced by one monk or one scholar, and in about the 15 to 1600s reproduced and then disseminated across the continent, were traveling across those different sites. One of the things I've observed back in London in recent years is the way in which students are trying physically to escape this place they call home or the school. So George in his 50-year project literally burrowing a way out a la Matta Clark to escape, having spent 6 years in our buildings, and get on to his career. This is the model we have for what a lecture hall, for example, can become today in the school. And we've been doing that not just by traveling from places like London to sites like this, but by trying to reconceive a school to operate not as a specific geographic location, so much as a constellation of different sites. This year we have about 700 students in London, enrolled in London, about 250 faculty members. We have about 1,200 students enrolled worldwide in 50 or 60 design workshops, public forums, and short courses that run throughout the world and that rotate each year. And the interest is how you can imagine a school as a kind of longitudinal chain of communication more than a series of specific sites and destinations. And again, the backdrop to that is that it's no big deal. Like, that is the way modern architecture has forever operated. Sort of an aging Walter Gropius in a helicopter flying in and out of office meetings at the end of his career. Remember, a guy whose entire career is defined by the ability to jump between continents, Germany to America, and the continual revolution of architectural education. A figure like this, kind of awkwardly dressed guy just getting off a plane. That is disheveled. Exactly the same. Who said once at one point in his life that of the 57 books that he wrote, Ford publishes 57 books, alongside all that other stuff he does. Of those 57 books, he says, by his calculation, something like 50 of them are written while he's either on an ocean liner or a plane. This is a guy who's constantly flying around the world with the belief not just that he's got a project to deliver, but there are worlds to understand and know. It was a template set by him, as a teenager when he drops out of art school in Switzerland and he goes on his famous voyage of the Orient, right, to record a series of discoveries that then become the basis for his own career. Even the critics of those guys, amazingly, have the same instinct. So Gropius is the great foil in Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's story of what's wrong with modernism. But how do they make that argument? They do the very same thing. They leave with their graduate students, their studios at Yale. They make a 10-day unit trip to Las Vegas in 1969, discover, as they say, a totally new world, and then spend 3 years crafting a monograph called Learning from Las Vegas, which is released in '72 as their argument for what's wrong with modern architecture. Again, something only possible by a discovery outside the studio. Maybe today's iconic figure of that, right? The fellow that doesn't just spend his life literally piloting the plane, Norman Foster, who was in your country a couple of weeks ago. By the way, he designed this plane, owns this plane, flies this plane. In an interview with the BBC, when asked what's the greatest building of the 20th century, says 747. The website that tracks Norman's activities around the world to know where the plane is. Some strange circulating stellar star. The architect has always been in motion. He or she have always been trying to leave the earth, but architecture has always been shaped around. I pulled out a couple of images of how that plays through the school today. This is one of my teachers at the AA. Robin Evans, the great architectural historian or theorist that you would never imagine actually drew stuff like this, but in 1969, his 5th-year project was for a city that would live in stars up above the landscape. Students today doing similar experiments at the school. This was a jury I was at a couple of years ago. One of our students, here's the jury, by the way. We're all just waiting for the disaster. She survived. But proving the point that architects would have never, ever invented lines. When we built this big shed a couple of years ago, the brief I had given them was to create a space where you could do sort of large-scale building prototypes. The students do the opposite, right? They're using it as their training field. In this case, for a study that a team was doing on the use of drones to deliver building materials to inaccessible sites. So they're developing their piloting skills. They're basically playing with toys. Another student doing something similar. Just one more of these sort of aerial experiments where architecture sort of leads here. This is an early physics system being used to test the movement of a series of gliders that this student shaped as a brief for the year, whose project was to travel the thermal currents above the outback of Australia. So these have to be self-propelled objects. He built a series of working prototypes after these early software studies, but whose purpose was to interfere the transmission of signals between satellites and a series of military bases on the western side of Australia. And what he's working out is this early sketch stage of the design is how these things can actually move through these currents. And what you see is that they're sort of lifting off of the thermals as they come off the landscape. The last part of the experiment with the school is just the obvious point that this stuff is opening up, which is today basically architecture schools are everywhere. One of Rem's theses 10 years ago was that architecture is everywhere. A corollary, you could say, is that architecture schools are everywhere other than just these places you and I inhabit during our working lives. And we've been testing this by creating these sort of performance spaces. It's a sort of thesis to experiment with. This is a Rayner Banham school that we briefly ran under a bridge in London, on a streetscape in London, under Norman Foster's bridge next to St. Paul's. We ran the 70s videos of Banham's visit to Los Angeles. The amazing thing was the school forms, right? For that afternoon, that early evening, that group of people haven't just left Bedford Square, they brought people in from the city. Those are the kind of experiments we've been doing in places like under this overpass in Sao Paulo, where we've been building this community center for this famous boxer in Brazil who is homeless and runs an academy and has no physical setting. Testing the limits of geography, the very end of the earth, basically as a kind of building or learning site. And that's one of the points of search engines is that they require deep search space for patterns to start to take on meaning. And so one of the reasons we're working with the scale of this project we are is to see where the discoveries might happen in unplanned ways. The nice thing about that version of school is that plane delays like the one I had today are basically just excuses to present work. The jury in an airport lounge somewhere in Kazakhstan. There's a group of people waiting to pick up on the train. A school running on the top of a bus in the Amazon jungle a couple of years before that. A cinema space in Lalibela in Ethiopia. This supple pavilion that a team of people did inside a Niemeyer, trying to take every aspect of Oscar Niemeyer's architecture and invert it into a soft, flexible, malleable structure. A village in the forests of Japan. Each of the schools kind of takes on its own character and life, depending on the setting. So some of them get a little more organized than others. They arrived with this their own flag to try. And this wasn't, by the way, the tutor. And the last example of these, which is just a really amazing site that these guys found. After a year or two of negotiation, we got access to Chernobyl, to what's called the exclusion zone of Chernobyl, which has been closed for 25 years since the accident in the 1980s because of the radiation. It's still permeates the landscape. This team of people ran a school that went across the Trans-Siberian Railway to arrive at Chernobyl and then spent 2 weeks documenting with a group of filmographers and other people. And what they start to record is a world very different than the one they imagined back in London. So this is still in Kazakhstan as they're moving out of the former Soviet space station. And they start getting interviews with the people that are in Chernobyl. There's a few people still left on the site monitoring.
My father, they were long dead. What would they have thought? Refugees came to the camp. Some claimed that they had lost loved ones.
The closer they got to it, the slightly creepier it got.
They thought their minds had been poisoned. I dream of my brother, sometimes, and his work beyond the contamination zone. They sent him to verify their regeneration claims. I can see him making his final preparations.
Yeah, I think you get the idea of that. It was not the world they expected. And of course, what you're seeing is what happens when a generation updates that model of architectural discovery. This is a famous photograph of Robert Venturi when he finally reaches Las Vegas. It's a different world than the one he expected. He doesn't quite fit in, you'll notice. But Bob's technology in 1969 is simply the camera that he had always used to photograph architecture. Venturi wasn't trained to draw. The way his classmates were, he studied with art historians at Princeton at undergraduate and graduate life. He recorded the world with photographs. First in Rome, he was at the American Academy, the famous Baroque architecture that becomes Complexity and Contradiction, and then in Las Vegas, where he takes a series of photographs that the graphic artist Muriel Cooper turns into the book you know. What happens today with the generation is, of course, that technology is morphed into a thing in which the distinguishing between a document and a construction, a fabrication and a recording is increasingly difficult to distinguish, and in fact the opposite, something to embrace, for the way in which that technology can start to describe even the most ordinary of events. This is a team of mine that was in Madagascar this summer on what looks like the most ordinary building site in the world. This is 2 people building a medium-sized building. This is the building construction industry in Madagascar. And what they do is they record that world to try and bring it back to an architectural culture in which this stuff simply doesn't exist as part of our consciousness. But they do it with technologies that, of course, don't just capture the motion, but start to describe the incredibly machinic-like qualities of these 2 brilliant guys who make 2,800 bricks a day, every day, of every week of their working career. A phenomenal kind of machine. And to have found in that landscape these kind of machines operating, I think was part of the real discoveries of that group when they were out there this summer. There's a whole range of excavation and other technologies which have been deployed across that landscape, which are the opposite of the big industrial machines that you and I think are destroying the landscape. Now, the final point is just obviously the way these 2 projects, from my side, the reinvention of the school, the student side with their projects, come together around what I say the genuine collective project of any school of architecture today, which is the invention of audiences and not architects. And I think the difficulty we all have when we get caught up in teaching and learning in a school is to think that the purpose of a school is to create architects. It's the opposite. That happens whether we wanted to or not, because you all are here for a few years, you graduate, you're an architect. The really challenging project is how you do that in settings in which audiences can be constructed, not just in events like this one tonight, but the minds can be brought together as what we know is the destination ultimately that all ideas have to live in. Ideas do not live in space. They do not live in books. They do not live in the laptop. They live literally in the minds of people who are interested in and who live in a world like architecture. And what we're interested in doing is to imagine how, with that technological bias, that we can use that technology to disrupt architectural cultures as they're already known. And again, the corollary argument is simply that disciplines have been doing this for many, many decades. A figure like Andy Warhol in his famous factory was a site, he said, not for making drawings and paintings and pictures. He had no interest in that. He did it, and he's known for it, but he hired people to do it. A collector famously once came to one of these bars and said, "Can I have a portrait?" He said, "Sure." Go down the hallway, Juan makes the paintings. Andy's interest was being in a space of exchange, discussions, parties, the bringing together of different people, and in a model that we would all think of in spaces very different than conventional institutions, but which make the obvious explanation of why someone like McLuhan, at the same time that Warhol is doing it, is realizing, look, minds are elsewhere in this day and age. Attention is in places other than classrooms or studios. So the obvious thing then is to start to think about the ways in which studios themselves become gathering places. When even the most ordinary event like an architectural jury, this is a series of student projects. I was invited to a presentation for a couple of weeks ago in which the critics get to have a much more active engagement with the project models, right? Where you can work with the traditional, habitual forms of discussion and debate and try and open up forms of performance. To conclude it all, the point is simply that architecture schools can really be more like airports than destinations, right? They're places we all just pass through. This is, when I took the picture 10 years ago, the most heavily inhabited building in human history. Heathrow Terminals 1, 2, and 3. 75 million people a year pass through these incredibly crowded interiors in a space that was designed for about a third of that, right? But who are there for just a brief moment in time to move on to a place. And that's in a way what you could say schools only ever are, right? Places that you and I inhabit in temporary form. For 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, in my case, sadly, 15 years, but which ultimately will be left behind by all of us. And the kind of communication imperative of schools, this is my paper, this is my real job. Fascinating job. That communication imperative of schools isn't promotional. I mean, I get this a lot as a publisher. AA Publications is a big publishing company now. It really isn't about promoting our work. Any act of publishing is simply the construction of a different kind of audience than those audiences that sit in juries or lecture halls or seminar rooms, right? Again, deeply embedded in the history of a discipline like architecture, which was founded 2,000 years ago when a young Roman architect published a book. 10 books. Right? Presented it to his emperor the following morning. And architecture as we know it is codified. The only surviving book from antiquity, 1,400 years later, is translated from Latin into a new language. And it's architecture over and over again, living through these kind of graphic spaces. The complication for me as a publisher for any school today, which I find a great one, is one of the unexpected consequences of these devices' arrival in the studio is now everybody's a publisher. I give my students books at school, presenting their final projects as monographs, basically. And sort of turning on its head the modernist invention of architecture by editors, 3 of them, Gropius, Mies, Korb, none of whom have done any building in the early 20th century, all of whom are claimed with inventing architecture, but all having done it with editorial experience. They're each editors at that time and crafting the skills and the command needed to make arguments for what architecture should be. What my students get to negotiate more than me is, of course, the problems of doing that paper-based activity in the world of all of these other media today, right? And negotiating that, the speed and the content and the scale of that sort of thing. For me, maybe just as a side point on it is, of course, as I'm doing that in London, people across the world, 6,000 miles away, are doing their version of our books illegally and releasing them in a form that's been in place in Europe as printing was industrialized forever, but the inability to now control these kind of media. This book is released annually, 28 days after this book is released, on the streets of Shanghai by a couple of guys near Tongji University who've got a great business model. I print on a good day 10,000 copies of this book. The will sell by the end of August. These guys will sell 60,000 copies in 2 cities in 2 months. At $2 a copy. But again, all of that, the background for that is the 19th century and the industrialization of printing as the precondition, really, to the arrival of modern architecture itself. One of the reasons modern architects were first editors is because that new medium had just arrived and become the basis for magazines and journals and things that allowed ideas to move very quickly. So when we see these kind of things today, this is one of our recent books, we republished a great 70s text by Enzo Mari, an industrial designer who threw away industrial design. And when you see those on these kind of platforms, it might seem alien to the architecture we know, but in fact it's just, again, a sort of renovation of something architects have been doing forever. And I think that ultimate challenge for all of that is how that latest technology then becomes a model, really, for a school itself. So a school isn't a site where you have to negotiate that stuff. A school becomes a place organized as if it's that sort of stuff. And I think that kind of crowd reality is the sort of ultimate question for schools today to find a way to negotiate. What happens when schools become nothing but an endless set of intersecting crowds, all gathered around the single figure of the student? Thanks.
I think there's a situation in architectural education. When you usually ask someone, students or even faculty, to define or describe something, he or she usually tells you, what is this for? My question is, if you identify this as a problem, and in the case of yes, how do you deal with that?
With that question?
Yeah, with that answer.
You'll have to tell me again.
Okay. What I found out is many times in architectural education,
Yeah.
if you ask someone to define or even describe something, he will answer,
Yeah.
what is this for?
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you identify this as a problem, how do you deal with that?
You're saying it in a way in which you identified it as a problem. Have you?
Yeah.
Okay. Why? I'm curious.
Well,
I mean, it seems like a reasonable question.
it's like a...
It seems like a reasonable question. I just want a little background to your question. What is it for? I mean, questions are always loaded, right?
Well, I
A
think
good
that...
student will know this, always. I know we have a secret agenda as teachers. Like, it's never neutral.
So,
No, seriously, it seems like a reasonable question. I mean, I wouldn't know what to say. I'd have to know what the question is. So give us an example. What kind of question?
describe a chair.
Describe a chair. And their response is?
A chair is something to sit on.
Yeah, but that's not the part that you were concerned about. It was they asked. They then say, why are you asking that question?
Why I'm asking this question? Because you're a director of the school, and I want you to know how you deal with that. If you think that this is a problem or not.
Yeah.
I think this is heritage of modernism.
How? Could be. Could be. I don't know. Describe a chair. It's like a trick question. Isn't it a trick question, by the way?
Excuse me?
Is it a trick question?
Well,
I mean, why did you ask them about a chair?
well, you showed some chairs.
I know, but I didn't ask questions about them. I got to think about that. I don't know. No. I mean, what you're touching on, which I find interesting, is that. Yeah. Okay. So let me work with this for a second. So what you're touching on is the fact that architectural learning is an exchange between, let's say in this case, two minds: a student, category person we think of as a student, and one called a teacher. I'm on board with that theory, that that's all architectural knowledge is. I mean, I honestly think this is what in philosophical terms are referred to as socialized theories of epistemology. Knowledge is only that thing that the world treats as knowledge. That's pretty much the heritage of 20th century analytic philosophy. Ludwig Wittgenstein is probably the guy best known for doing the most work on that problem. I.e. that we come to a kind of agreement amongst ourselves about what an idea or something we take to be knowledge is. And the only way that thing exists as knowledge, because we can't prove it to be the case, there's no rational or logical way to demonstrate it, because every attempt at logical proof, what was once called logical positivism, can be shown to break down ultimately. In the end, by the middle of the 20th century, what Wittgenstein reached at the end of his career was simply a belief that knowledge is that thing which we treat as knowledge. I am totally on board with that view. I mean, in fact, I almost can't even imagine the opposite. And the kind of work I'm showing up here on the screen is really trying to just make the point that architecture is that which we declare architecture to be, period. And it's a constant battle, and it's never going to be agreed to. And guess what? As soon as you and I die, somebody else is going to take the argument somewhere else, right? That, to me, is what a culture is. Like, that's almost what it should be. That's why I like the idea, you know, that the question, it's not about having a right answer to the question. It's not even about rejecting the question. It's about embracing the exchange necessary. I mean, I would say the modern model of teaching in a studio is nothing but that. That's why we tell students here to go sit in the studio 3 days a week. It's not just to like keep them busy, although it often feels like that when you're a student. It really isn't. It really isn't that. It's that. And my school is probably an extreme case of this. But I'm totally serious when I say that as a school, we have no idea what architecture is. And that's what gets us in the building in the morning. That's why you spend your days in the studio. Otherwise, it's just manual labor. And when you're lucky, you get to do that by sitting next to a person who will ask you exactly that kind of question. And you might like deflect it, like, what the hell, I know what a chair is. It's actually a famous essay by John Searle on the question of a chair. But, you know, it's about the exchange of ideas. And, you know, what I refer to in this talk as communication technologies are really just an amplification or an extension of exactly the sort of things that have always happened in the physical space of a design studio or an office. And all I guess I'm really showing tonight is what's happening in the kinds of experiments we're running about how you test the boundaries and the limits of that kind of exchange. That? I mean, my idea is completely wrong, of course. Like if I gave you the counter model, I did an event with Toyo Ito last autumn in Tokyo. I presented it was actually very collegial, like we're friends. We have different views of what architecture should be, but I showed our model of sort of chaos, learning by experimentation, lots of failure, and lots of failure that we embrace. Toyo Ito has launched a school in the last year, which is called the Ito School, which teaches Ito. And you enroll in the school and you learn Ito-san. You know, it's pretty cool. And we didn't hold a debate to see, like, is Ito's model better than London's model? It was actually to embrace the fact that there ought to be different models of learning or defining what architecture is. Like, that is what makes it a culture, I think. And that's why, I mean, for me, the tribal model really matters in architecture. I mean, to separate where we are now, I think, from previous generations who were pretty comfortable, like, Korb was pretty happy with there really being 5 principles. And if we got it and we bought it, we could do it too. You know, I think that was just the moment of where modern architecture was at that time. I think the fact that we all are now getting so good at not just doing the weird little things we do, but communicating them and building audiences around them. But one of the bigger questions for a school, I think, that we'll get to sometime soon is what role might they play in those different communities talking to one another, in that they're getting pretty good at ignoring one another completely. And I have friends in all the camps, but I promise you the parametricists never talk to the English minimalists, who have no interest in the European event-based people, or those officers that do nothing but write programs and briefs for people. They're each super interesting projects, but they're completely separate universes today.
In that sense, I was wondering about the tribal model. How do you, first of all, who defines the tribes in this set? if you did, or if they did, or how that process happened, and how is the, so in the sense of, what is the process of rationalization that happens?
The process
of rationalization that happens, that makes a tribe a tribe, and that names it and guides it in a certain direction. If you have all of that, or how many there are, what's the reduction that's operated in that, and how you describe a pattern happening there as well? Like if not the position, let's say, but how would you describe weights or trends?
Yeah, no, that's a nice question. The constraint I had on this matrix, I'm sort of a fan of 3x3 grids, so I just worked with 9. And the constraint I had was it was a 2-hour flight from San Salvador to Sao Paulo this morning. And I knew I couldn't let it be too complicated. And I was saying I didn't want to keep you guys up all night, like with 50 different tribes. But I for example, there's no, let me make clear, that was a sort of framework that I provided just to try and give you a way of sampling the work. But I don't really think they're self-aware groups. I mean, some of them are, like the parametricists are weirdly self-aware. Like they know who their friends are and they really know who their enemies are. But many of these groups don't so much. In fact, many would absolutely disagree with me as soon as I put them in, man, like this is the kind of talk I can only do here. Like if I do this in London, like, but for me, the tribal thing would be, the definition of that as a kind of cluster or group would be their ability to talk internally to one another, to feel some sense of alignment. And I think there are, like I can't remember what they're called, the title of these groups in England right now, the New English, which are a group of people that aren't really the minimalists, because they're interested in craft and material in ways that become almost decorative. They really are a gang of people. Like there's 6 or 8 of them who meet regularly and talk, and I think it's just a matter of finding collaborators, like people in which a conversation really matters more than anything. In terms of how that map came together in Bedford Square, I appointed everybody, which makes it a very artificial environment, right? I kind of work with people that, to me, the criteria I always use, and I'm totally candid about it in the school, is the work needs to have an argument and a position that it can situate in relation to something larger happening. Like I need to hear that as a kind of self-awareness. But what you really need in a school like ours, and this won't be the case in other schools, but what you absolutely have to have in our school is the ability to talk to those other groups throughout the year. One of the reasons for that is a totally mechanical one, but at the AA, your student work isn't assessed by your tribal leader. Your tutor that you've worked with for 32 weeks or longer in some of these, the work is assessed collectively by a panel of other tutors, which for me has always highlighted the need for people to have a sensibility where they can really talk to one another. Not everybody can do that. It's not a universal, it's not like an inherently good thing. Like there's some architects who frankly can barely talk to their staff, let alone completely divergent positions. But we're a school and not an office. Like it really is a learning environment. And at the end of year, our students put a portfolio on the table in one of these books, and it's assessed. I mean, you know it well, Cyril. And what's being assessed is whether, in fact, learning took place, not whether it fulfills the agenda of a unit master or a brief or a studio. And that requires an active communication, which has to then be built into the people that are teaching in it. And so, for me, that's like one of those kind of key criteria for deciding who should join into that matrix or that. And because it is a conversation, I think the thing that Alvin said years ago is really true. It's like organizing a dinner. You just want to make for interesting conversation. It's like people that will actually join into a discussion at a table, and through that maybe spark a way of thinking or talking or reacting to something. Again, like totally going back to that previous point, I'm defending it from a sort of totally socialized position. The fact of social interchange or exchange between. Other questions? Anybody over here in the lights? Are we done? Sorry for keeping you so late. I was late. Any other questions? Thanks, you guys. Thank you.